Welcome ladies and gentlemen, today I will be talking about a couple of cylindrical or Manchurian thumb rings which I have made over the last couple of months and tried out, and I will be going into the various materials and a little bit in terms of the shape these have. Just generally a quick disclaimer before we get into it: I am an enthusiast and not an expert nor a historian, so what I say is mostly based on my own experience and experimentation and shooting bows. I have used some resources historically. I will link them down below, especially Peter Decker, who runs Manchu and Manchu Archery.org. As well as another website which I will link down below. The other thing is I currently shoot a 40-pound bow, so I am not 100% sure how these things that I will tell you apply to both bows of higher draw weights. So if you're shooting, I don't know, a 100-pound bow, I think you should take what I say with a grain of salt, just to be on the safe side in terms of the structural integrity of each of these rings. Now, I have a couple of thumb rings right here. I will go through them in order of the times that I made them basically. And the first one I ever made, this is a wooden thumb ring with a piece of horn attached to the top of it. This was the first thumb ring I ever made. It was what I had available at that time. There's a definite disadvantage to wood, and that is that it has a specific grain. And the way you probably manufacture these is that you go with the grain, but that has the disadvantage that it's a lot more likely to shear and tear at the line of those of the grain line effectively when you're drawing a bow. So what I did was attach a piece of horn. I glued it and pinned it. I would definitely recommend, if you go with this type or this style of thumb ring, that you fix it both mechanically as well as with glue, because otherwise the risk of the wood itself snapping is probably reasonably high, and that could damage your bow and injure you. So I definitely recommend, if you want to make a wooden type of thumb ring, attach some sort of other material on top that distributes the forces. In this case I used horn, glued it on, pinned it on. It worked fairly well, but I generally wouldn't recommend it unless you have either a relatively low draw weight bow, or you go for a specific look for, I don't know, your personal pleasure. This one, for example, was like mesa wood, so it looked pretty nice, but I wouldn't recommend it, especially if you go above 40 pounds. And if you want to use wood, definitely attach a piece of horn or something of the likes on top. Next up was the first horn ring I ever made, which is made from water buffalo horn. Generally, this is one of my favorite materials for thumb rings, not necessarily because it makes the best thumb rings, but because it's cheap, readily available. It usually comes in cylindrical form already, so it's pretty easy to keep it basically in the correct shape, keep it in the right dimensions, and actually get a proper thumb ring out of that. And it can take a fair amount of load. I do not know how well they work with higher draw weights above 40-50 pounds, but for 40 pounds there's not a doubt in my mind they don't break if you keep them at a relatively usable thickness, so above like 5 millimeters at the top I would recommend. But if you keep it there, I do not think that these will cause any problems. The nice part about these is that they are so easy to work with. They are easy to drill, they are easy to carve with a knife, files work wonders on them, they are easy to sand and polish up if you want that. So I definitely recommend, if you start out and you want to make your first thumb ring, you don't know what material to use, and it's a lot more difficult to get antler or bone to work as well. I definitely recommend horn, buffalo horn, water buffalo horn, whatever you can find, cow horn in general, because these are really easy to make, and they, especially in the beginning, will just work. And since it is a reasonably cheap material, you will be able to manufacture a couple of these, and I think that's very important to get a feeling for how the thumb ring should feel. If you go ahead and you get material that's a little more expensive or more difficult to work with, and you end up trashing the thumb ring because you file too much or something like that, you will be annoyed and you won't have a proper thing to work with. But if you get horn, you can get a lot of it for a relatively cheap price and just experiment a little bit. So definitely one of my favorite materials just because of the availability. Next up, we have a thumb ring made from Antler. Now, these I enjoy for their lightness mainly. This is an incredibly light material. I mean, in terms of the material itself, Antler is bone effectively, but it's a lot lighter than the straight up bone ring I have. Now, I had problems in getting a piece of Antler that was both the right kind of size and shape, because the problem is that you have a denser outer layer and you have like spongy bone inside, and ideally you have a complete ring of dense bone on the top. If you have any spongy bone in the corners of it or in the area that the string rolls over, and I've had that with another one of these, it will wear it down relatively quickly, both the string as well as the thumb ring itself. So I recommend that you, no matter what you do with these, you definitely make sure that the entire outer ring is made of dense bone. And that can cause a problem because that means you need a fairly large piece of Antler actually, and it needs to be properly round so that when you drill a hole into it, you have a circle of dense bone if possible. Now that was a little bit of a problem. This was actually one of the best pieces I had, and it's not perfectly cylindrical. So Antler is probably a very robust material and will last up to higher draw weights. I don't have a doubt about that, but it can be difficult to acquire the proper materials for this. So I recommend if you get Antler, check out the type of Antler that you have beforehand, and depending on where you live, it can also be more difficult to get Antler, as well as thinking about the size that you need. It has to be a relatively big stack to give off a piece of Antler that you can use properly, as you need a cylindrical round piece in itself. Don't imagine that you can use like the base of the Antler, which is oftentimes not shaped completely round, and use that, because you will just have one side of compact bone and one side of spongy Antler, and that just won't work properly. So I recommend, if you have the chance to look at the Antler beforehand, the actual piece, definitely do that, because not every piece of Antler is sufficiently constructed for that, so to speak. But that brings us on to the next thumb ring. And this one is made from cow bone. It's a metatarsal, so the longitudinal bones in the foot. And this is probably my favorite ring to shoot. It is a lot heavier than the other rings, definitely, but first off, it feels crisper. I cannot explain why. It's not the geometry, because I've mimicked that geometry in other materials as well. Bone just feels a little bit crisper, it feels a little more secure. On the other hand, it can be difficult to come by depending on where you live. I found one store who sells them, who sells this type of bone that you need, because you obviously need the right circumference, and if you don't have the right circumference, then it can be difficult because you run into the same problem effectively like you have with the Antler, whereas you have spongy bone and you have compact bone, and you need to get right the sweet spot so you have a complete ring of compact bone. But if you get that, this is probably the peak ring, at least in my opinion, at least from my experimentation. This is so solid, I don't worry about this. If I gave this to somebody who can shoot a 100-pound ring, or a 100-pound bow, sorry, I wouldn't worry that this would snap at all. This is solid as hell, and I am not worried about that at all, and it gives a very secure feeling and a great release. So in terms of quality of shooting and quality of release and ability to hold, I definitely recommend bone. It's my favorite material for that, no question at all. But if you are starting out and bone can be difficult to acquire, it's more difficult to work with, as you can't use a knife. You can scrape it as well as you can with horn. You need to usually abrade it with files, sandpaper, etc. It's just a lot more difficult to work with. The results are worth it if you can get it, but also you need to find the ring inside the bone, which is more difficult. So if you're starting out, I recommend horn, and you're not certain about, okay, what shape do I need, what size do I need, etc. Get yourself a couple of these horn rolls and just experiment with those, because that's the cheapest way you can get a satisfactory ring. Once you've had experience with that and you know what kind of shape and fit you need, then bone is probably a best option to go forward and to regularly shoot. It is the most comfortable to use. And also the most solid one. So once I work up to higher draw weights, I will definitely switch to bone only probably, just because it's so much, it feels so much more solid eventually. But I can speak for at least up to 42 pounds my bow usually has, depending a little bit on humidity. Horn ring does everything you need, and especially in the beginning, especially I made this one right now for a video, especially if you just need to experiment a little bit with shapes and fit, horn all the way. Once you know what you want, probably bone. Let's talk a little bit about the various shapes each of these thumb rings has now. The first thing you'll notice obviously is the difference in height. Now, this is obviously personal preference. There is an argument to be made for either one. Personally, I feel like longer thumb rings, especially in the beginning, when I didn't feel comfortable with shooting them, I feel like longer thumb rings offer a little bit more stability just because they have more contact to your thumb, which means that it's easier to hold on to them, and when you haven't quite figured out the fit, that's the more secure option. When you know how to do it and you get the feeling and the fit right, obviously you can also go to a shorter one, and an advantage of that is just being able to quickly push it back and grab something. If I do that with the longer bone ring, for example, I can't really make a fist. This is the extent my thumb will bend in, while with this short one, when I push it back, I can effectively curl my hand into a normal fist. While you are shooting, now that people are not running around with swords on their hips and in a battlefield with bows usually, I think go for whatever feels more comfortable. Personally, I go for something in the middle. So if we look at these three, you have basically from small to big, from, in this case, this side to this side. And that goes back to what I said. I just made this ring, for example, to try around with another size of fit, so it's horn again, because I want to try around. And it really is personal preference, which is why I recommend trying out various types of materials and rings over the time you shoot these. The next thing is the surface area which the string itself rests upon, so the top layer base, so to speak, the one that's closer to your to the palm of your hand, effectively. If I hold up this one, it has a lot more rounded top side right here, versus this one, which basically has a mostly flat top side, slight slope on it, and then cornered edges, and then curved edges. Excuse me. Generally, it depends on the way you draw the bow. Obviously, the flatter and wider it is, the more base it's going to give for your string, which means that you will have a more secure hold on your string and it will place a little less strain on your finger itself. The more rounded it is, however, the crisper your release will be. So you need to find a sweet spot in the beginning, or a sweet spot in the middle where you are comfortable. In the beginning, when you make the first couple of horn rings, I definitely recommend you going for a relatively flat and also relatively wide top. I made the mistake of going rounded early, and it ends up just jamming the string into the flesh of your thumb right above the thumb ring, and you will develop calluses there. It's going to be uncomfortable and painful, and it really doesn't need to be. So I'd recommend when you start out, try to get mostly a flat edge on top, and then just curve over the corners so it doesn't wear as much on your string. When you feel a little more comfortable, you can obviously slim the ring down in terms of width. I wouldn't, at least with horn, go below 5 millimeters. I would keep that at least. But but once you feel more comfortable, you can also round it off a little more. One more thing that you will inevitably run into sooner or later is straight sides versus concave sides. So this one bends in this way effectively. And really, in my eyes, it comes down to subjective shooting. There isn't any definite answer to this. I think it's very much personal preference, whether or not you prefer that. I generally like the concave version a little more. It feels like it locks my thumb in a little better, but it very much depends on the way you hold your thumb ring. If you, for example, pinch your middle finger, the ball of your middle finger, this fleshy part right here, in front of the thumb ring, in that case you benefit a little less from the concave side, and it is more work to put it in properly and evenly. But if you use the middle finger in the way that you just push it against it here and you just lock it with your index finger over the top, in that case you actually have a pretty reasonable advantage to having it concave, because it just creates, through the slope, a better hold on the ring. I would recommend that you try that out also with different length, because for some reason I feel it's a little more comfortable with the longer thumb rings to have the concave in there. Just because the longer the thumb ring, the more difficult to me it becomes to actually hook the middle finger over the top. So when you have a longer thumb ring, I feel like it's more beneficial to have the concave in. But again, that's personal preference. I just recommend trying it out, because obviously this is a very personal thing and everybody has different hands as well. So let me know what you think in the comments down below. If you found this interesting, I hope you leave a like for this. And other than that, if you have any questions left, please post them in the comments below. And until then, I see you next time. Goodbye.